I'm delighted to be here. This is my first visit to the University of Missouri, although on a family trip about 30 years ago, my family and I drove through Columbia, and I had a chance to anticipate eventually coming back to visit, and I had no idea I would be coming back under such pleasant circumstances. And my thanks to Christy and the committee and to the department staff for arranging a splendid visit so far. And I'm happy to be here with you to talk about the development of belonging. The study that is the basis for most of what I want to say today is an unusual one in that we have taken from the beginning of this work the idea that relationships were going to be key. It's not the only phenomenon that we're interested in, but relationships have turned out to be enormously important in predicting all sorts of life outcomes for the participants in this project. So we're looking at the embedding of adult relationships, really, in a series of relationships that are important in various ways, to various extents, throughout the life cycle. And we're interested in knowing what that embedding involves and how it is carried forward into later manifestations on the part of the children in the study. I truly always have to say I'm carrying quite a load on my back, a number of collaborators and generations of students who have contributed to this work, and you will see more of the impact of all of those individuals as I talk today. But let me start out by saying the study that I now participate in began in the inspiration of John Bowlby's attachment theory. My colleague Alan Srofe, who was one of the early members of our team, is a fully ordained member of the Church of Attachment. I am not. And I'm always eager to tell people that. So that you will not expect that everything I say about attachment is the standard material that gets presented in connection with attachment. But there are a couple of premises of attachment as a point of view that are especially important to thinking about belonging. One is that attachment is a series of species-typical behaviors that have evolved through natural selection. And attachment implicates hormones and peptides associated with lactation and the regulation of pain and stress. So increasingly, when we talk about attachment, we are pushed willingly to look at biomarkers as well. And that has been part of the natural history of our project. As the years have passed, we've done a great deal more in terms of looking at biomarkers. And what all that leads to are mutually regulated dyadic systems. From birth forward, experiences in the successive life periods form and modify those regulated dyadic systems and the relationship-relevant behaviors, emotions, and cognitions that comprise them. Reading in other fields these days, I see the vestige of attachment ideas surfacing in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see. This is from a book by Planet Fitness and Fair, a communication scholar and two social psychologists, who write, bonding patterns established in infancy may also carry over or become reestablished in adult relationships and emerge as emotional reactions to relationship challenges or losses. Relationship functioning is always a function of history and current circumstances. So if you are inclined to think of attachment as something you predict from to certain specific outcomes, you'll be missing the boat. You need to know about current circumstances and the way in which attachment sets people up to respond to the current experiences of their lives. The main thing for us is that the history of security with significant partners from birth forward promotes belonging. Among other things, it inspires the confidence to explore novel or challenging social situations. It instills the idea of empathy and provides for the learning of basic social skills. Importantly, it helps create positive expectations about others' responsiveness to oneself. And the very core thing about attachment that is often unappreciated is that it is fundamentally about the regulation of emotions. So belonging requires a kind of skilled regulation of emotions and interactions with other people that enable individuals to form lasting connections. And it serves a stage-setting function. For example, we have extensive evidence showing that peer relationships elaborate and expand on the abilities that are formed in attachment relationships. So let me take a minute to look at an overview of what I'd like to do today. First, I want to talk about the long arm of childhood relationships and the ways in which we can expect childhood relationships to become manifested in the experiences of one's contemporary life. And then I want to talk about our research approach. It's a project that has engaged in longitudinal developmental research from birth up through age 32. Our participants are now actually 35. We just don't happen to be collecting a full wave of data on them right now. But we see them frequently, and interestingly, we are re-interviewing their mothers, who were our participants up through age 17 for their children. And since then, we have not had regular contact with them. But they're back in the game now. And then I'll tell you about some multi-method analyses of relationship history and functioning in couples, and speculate a bit about the implications for belonging. So why do we think it made sense for us to pursue this longitudinal look at relationships? Because we had bits and pieces of information from very early in the history of the study of relationships that showed 64% to 77% concordance between infant attachment classifications in the U.S. and adult attachment classifications in the same people. That was one clue that was important. It also turned out that mothers' adult attachment scores predicted their infant's attachment 75% of the time. So something was going on in this critical mother-child relationship that looked like it might offer important clues about the nature of the way in which close relationships are carried forward from one time to another. We also had the interesting finding that there's considerable concordance in some studies across 3 generations: the grandmother's attachment orientation, the mother's attachment classification, and the infant's attachment classification. So there's a big system operating here, and we wanted to know more about what it involves and how it works. Also, we began to have findings fairly early on in our study that showed that attachment in infancy was related 5, 6, 7 years later to the effectiveness of individuals' peer relationships in school. So early insecurity predicts more competitive and aggressive interactions in preschool. That has implications for how the child adjusts to school and how successfully their school experiences are adopted and worked into their way of thinking about the world. Also, we can predict from infant attachment classification to adult romantic relationships. And that's certainly a topic I want to spend some time with you talking about today. For example, we know that early insecurity in relationships with caregivers predicts greater hostility to romantic partner, at ages 20, 21. That's over a very long span of time. But the effect size is substantial. So, how have we conducted this study to give us information of that sort and a great deal more. It is the Minnesota longitudinal study of risk and adaptation. The key question really is, what are the processes that account for continuity and change in adaptation from birth to maturity? We have looked through the years at multiple aspects of adaptation. At the beginning, the central ones were normative social development, educational achievement and functioning, and psychopathology. The outcome variables of interest to us have expanded. So, for example, now we're very interested in adult health outcomes, which we're finding to be importantly related to the early relationship experiences I just mentioned. Let me tell you about my partners in crime here. The man on the left is Byron Egeland, trained as an educational psychologist, and early in his career, very interested in child abuse. He started a study by going to the Minneapolis Public Health Department and asking if he could recruit mothers from their prenatal clinics. And what you need to know about those prenatal clinics is that the people who attended them all fell below the poverty line at that time. Why was he interested in doing that? Because at that point, the best clue to the origins of child abuse lay in the data showing a strong relation to poverty. So he wanted to understand more about why that might be and how it plays out in individual lives. He got about 2 years into the study and realized he had a lot more going on than just risk for child abuse. And so he was talking to his Minnesota colleague and mine, Alan Srofe, on the right, who introduced him to Bowlbian ideas and the framework that said many of the things that go on in normal intercourse between caregivers and children predispose children to be at risk for a whole range of dysfunction, including to be at risk for being abused by others. So they carried on for about 15 years. And when they got to adolescence, they said, oh, I don't think we know enough about adolescence to do this. We're okay in infancy and elementary school, but adolescence is another matter. So they sought help. And I joined them when the participants were about 16. I designed the romantic relationships parts of the waves at 16, 19, a special assessment at 20, 21, age 23, and so forth. And it's been great, great work to do. And I owe them a very great deal because I mentioned carrying them on my back today a minute ago. Actually, they carry me on their back all the time because they did such brilliant work getting this study started 35 years ago. Now, we need more help. And so we turn to our Minnesota colleague, whom some of you may know, Jeff Simpson, who is a very talented and influential social psychologist, understands development very well, and was extremely interested in this data set. So we're having a very happy time. Jeff is the PI, for example, on our National Institute of Aging grant, in which we're looking at health outcomes and risk from the social experiences of early and middle childhood, early life period, and risk of inflammatory disease and a number of other outcomes that you probably can surmise just from hearing about the setup of the study. We also, I'm happy to say, have one of our own back at Minnesota now, Glenn Roisman, who has been pursuing his career at the University of Illinois, came back to Minnesota and has rejoined the project, but also has his own laboratory. So we have an abundance of riches these days. Let me talk for a minute about the longitudinal developmental perspective. I don't want to insult you, but I'm hoping everybody realizes that longitudinal and developmental are not necessarily the same thing. You can have longitudinal studies that are not developmental in the least. So let me talk about what we're looking at. We're interested in the main challenges that confront individuals at each life period. It's sort of a life task orientation. Might take you back to your graduate school days. Some faculty members like Robert Havighurst, Harry Stack Sullivan, Eric Erickson, all of those people had a life task kind of orientation. And we've adopted that to a good extent. And the idea is to say, what is the biggest challenge developmentally an individual is likely to face in this period of his or her life? We are interested in both continuity and change. And we're looking, of course, for lawful change, change that should occur and is more or less beneficial in many instances to the individual. We think it's important to pay attention to the essential environmental supports for individuals who are trying to confront the challenges of a particular age period. And we're interested in the near and long-term consequences of difficulties and environmental deficits that individuals experience. So when we talk about collecting longitudinal developmental data, we're interested in knowing those pieces of information, but also having hypotheses about why one makes the change at a particular age period. What is it about the issues of that age period that make change more or less likely, and how does change come about? Let me tell you about our participants. These were the ones that Byron recruited from the prenatal clinics at the Minneapolis Public Health Department. He recruited, in total, 265 mothers having their first babies. They were in the third trimester of pregnancy at the time. So this longitudinal study begins before birth. The mothers' ages at delivery varied pretty widely, from age 12 to age 34. The average was 20. 83% were Caucasian, 12% African American. Many of the African Americans were actually mixed race. 58% of the mothers were single at the time of the infant's birth. 59% of them were high school graduates. Some were college students, but not many. Their IQ test scores range from 49 to 142. The mean is 105. And they had a variety of occupations: clerical and service workers, laborers, professional administrative folks, students. 15% of them were unemployed. This is all at the time of the baby's birth. So remember, this was supposed to be a sample that was at risk for poverty and thereby for child abuse. So you see that we do have a range of individuals in this category. Some of them undoubtedly look to you like they are more likely to move out of the poverty category than others do, which is very promising for a longitudinal study. Today, we still have 185 of those 265 participants in the study. It takes a lot of work to keep people in a longitudinal study for that long. And we have had a fabulous staff to help us do that work. Half of them are stable and economically independent. The other half show the full range of dysfunction that you might expect of individuals who started out in a high-risk environment for poverty. 51% have stable, relatively stable relationships, which we rate as high quality and growth enhancing. About 10% are college graduates. That may be a little higher now. Every year, somebody else sort of seems to complete, which is wonderful and always celebrated in our project. 19% are still getting some kind of schooling, which is also positive. 75% working, and that's even in this terrible economic situation. And the majority say they're satisfied with, happy with their work lives. Our last wave suggests that a number of them also talk about their economic worries pretty freely, and they have considerable ones, as many of us do. All participants were studied at birth, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, 30 months, 42 months, 48 months, 54 months, and 64 months. I mean, it's everybody in the sample we tried to see at all of those times. So within the first few years of the study, we got a lot of information. And remember, we've been collecting information during the prenatal period as well. Then, again, we continued at kindergarten, grades 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7, and continued at ages 16, 17 and a half. And this is when our original participants, their mothers, dropped out. 19, 23, 26, 28, and 32. So we have a fairly dense set of data in terms of measurement points. We also have done some intensive studies of subsamples in the group. So when there were 4, percentage of them were invited to participate in nursery school classrooms in our nursery school in the Institute of Child Development. And we devoted 2 classrooms over a 2-year period to children from the study. So we're able to observe them in the classroom, observe them with the teachers, and so forth. And you can imagine what a rich data resource that was. Then when they were 10 and 11, we brought them back for 4-week summer camps. We did this 2 summers in a row, and set up a camp on the Institute grounds and other nearby buildings, used the university swimming pools, and it was really quite an experience. They came 5 days a week, they stayed all day, and we collected data throughout. The counselors collected data. Then when they were 15, we brought them back for a weekend retreat, camp reunion. These are the same people who'd been in the summer camps. And then we began to see them with their romantic partners. And we saw the couples at ages 21, 21, 26, 27, and we're now seeing them at 33 to 35. Sometimes the same partners, more often not. So we've come at this group a lot of different ways, and we come at them in a lot of different settings. Sometimes they come to our laboratories. Sometimes we go to their homes. We've seen them in school. And remember, this sample was collected at the public health department. There's no reason to have expected that they were going to be in a few schools. Practically every child was in a different school. So going to one school didn't mean we were going to get data on 2 children or 3 children. It meant 1 child. And the teachers were wonderfully cooperative. We asked a lot of them, and they gave us a lot. And then the summer camps and the retreat. We also have multiple data sources, and this was a principle of the study from the very beginning. We have observer data. We have sometimes observations in our laboratories, sometimes in schools, sometimes in homes. We have ratings of each individual child by teachers, counselors, parents, and now, because we're studying their work lives, their supervisors. And they give us permission to do this. They are incredibly generous with their lives. Standard test data, self-report data from caregivers and participants, and school and public records, including criminal records. In each time period, we've made relationships an important component of what we learned about. So, for example, in infancy, one target was exploratory behavior. Think attachment, exploratory behavior. And attachment manifested in relationships. Preschool was curiosity and problem solving, yes, but also group entry skills, and beginning peer affiliation. In middle childhood, school achievement and adjustment, but also networks and friendships. In adolescence, identity, behavior problems, regulation, but also mixed gender groups, friendship, intimacy, and dating. In early adulthood, school and work functioning, yes, but also romantic relationships and family formation. And now, in adulthood, work competence, adjustment, community, health, well-being, but also marriage and partnering, parenthood, friendships, and social networks. So at every age, we have an age-appropriate take on relationships. We have an age-appropriate take on things that are related to achievement, status, and so forth. So that makes it possible for us to look across ages at functioning in similar domains. Let me tell you a little bit about the relationship assessments that we've conducted since middle adolescence, which is, as you remember, when I joined the project. We've done that at 16, 19, 23, 26, and 32. And we've started with a history of their romantic relationships, dating history, or as they form more permanent relationships, their partner history. Activities with and feelings about their partners. Tell me about a time when you felt especially close to your partner. What happened? What were you doing? How did you, move forward from that to the next thing? Tell me about the biggest fight or argument you've had in the past month. How did that get resolved? And they've been very open with us about it. Coder ratings on 5-point scales, then, of overall quality based on these interviews. At the high end, scores reflect mutual caring, trust, support, emotional closeness. At the low end, relationships are bland and empty, hurtful to one or both parties, rigid roles are in play, chronic, intense conflict, and victimization. We've been very careful about reliabilities here, and you see that our interclass R's, which is what we use to calculate reliability, range from 0.85 to 0.93. That took a lot of coder training and very careful writing of scales, but it's worth it. Then, in addition to the interviews, we have other assessments. At age 23, for example, we interviewed them about their dating history and their current relationship, and we coded for all participants information about effectiveness in conducting their relationships. The high scores formed and maintained positive relationships, or they got out of bad relationships. The low scorers had not been in a relationship, or they had stayed in negative relationships. Again, our interclass R here was 0.94. That's turned out to be a very telling variable for predicting later relationships. And then we had observational procedures. This is the setup we use in Jeff Simpson's lab, where we have individuals talking about problems that they both identify as problems in their relationship. And then we also give them some other conflict resolution tasks to do. In that procedure, we observe their collaborative problem solving, and we code ratings of overall quality of relationship, hostility, anger, positive and negative emotion, etc., in their interactions. And again, our interclass R's are pretty high, 0.82 to 0.96. So how do we get relationship history tied together with these more current observations of relationship functioning? Well, we have a composite measure that we call the caregiving composite. based on information from the child in interaction with caregivers at ages 12 through 42 months. Some of those are well-known assessments of stable relationships. For example, the strained situation. We had done that at 12, 18, and 24 months. Then we had maternal teaching tasks, where the task was set up so that the child was almost ready to solve a particular problem, usually a physical manipulation problem, but not quite. He needed some support or help from somebody who was more skilled than he. So we're talking about if you're a Vygotskian scaffolding. And so the extent to which the mother provided that support in an appropriate and sensitive way, picked up on the child's cues, realized help was needed, and then stepped in to help, and then got out of the way again, was included in this caregiving composite. We also had measures of peer competence. Remember I said we did observations in schools. And what we did was work up a prototypical description of a child who has good relationships with peers. And we gave it to the teachers, and we asked them to rank order every child in their classroom according to how good a fit that child was to this prototypical description of a well-adjusted child in peer relations. Why do we ask them to do every child in the classroom when they only had one child we were really interested in? Because we didn't want them to realize which child we were interested in, and we wanted them to be pretty objective in placing that child in the rank order from best fit to poorest fit of all the children in their classroom. And they did it for us. And then we took that information, looked at the number of children in the classroom total, and looked at the number of children who were above or below our child, and came up with a rating of how this child stacked up in peer relations within that classroom. And that was the score we used. Now, the description included things like, is generally accepted by other children, has some friends. Didn't matter how many friends they had, they just needed to show that they could have something that looked like a friendship rather than just like an acquaintanceship. Shows some leadership when the peer group works together. Collaborates well with children when the peer group has something to do. So all of those things were a part of this prototypical description. Parent-child collaboration, which we did at age 13, which all of you, I suspect, will recognize, is the age at which you expect least smooth and effective parent-child collaboration. But when we looked at the degree in problem-solving tasks, to which there was good collaboration between children and their parents, the emotional support the parents provided, and the effectiveness of the conflict resolution. And by effectiveness, we mean that the parties in the conflict seemed pretty satisfied with the way this had turned out. And we're able to code effectiveness quite effectively. So the inter-class correlations for those ratings were 0.93. Friendship security ratings at age 16 based on an interview in which we asked the extent to which they felt they could completely be themselves with their friend without fear of rejection. So let me talk about a few key findings. First, we now know, with the help of all that background information about the children in the study, plus our ratings of their current dating relationships or romantic relationships, that the quality of romantic relationships in early adulthood, that is at ages 21 to 22, is significantly related to relationship experiences from birth forward, from infancy to childhood to adolescence and so forth. Relationship history from birth through middle adolescence is significantly associated with indicators of harmony and flexible functioning. For example, effective conflict resolution and shared positive emotion at 21 to 22 and also at 26 years. There's a good deal of coherence among these among these relationship experiences, which could explain why they feed forward in such an important way to romantic relationships. And let's just look at the difference between being in a relationship and the quality of that relationship. So here we're trying to predict whether or not a young person has a romantic relationship, is engaged in being with someone else pretty actively. Infancy does not predict that. However, age 13, emotional support and conflict resolution in families, peer competence at grade 6, and friendship competence at age 16 do predict whether or not the person is in a relationship. Why? Because all these things are things that make it possible for people to be engaged with others, to be an attractive partner in interaction, and, frankly, to have group memberships that allow for connecting with somebody else in a special way to form a romantic relationship. But if we look at relationship quality, responsive care in infancy does predict your relationship quality at ages 20, 21, as well as these other predictors. So that makes sense in a way. We're talking about relationships throughout the period of development, but what really matters is what the child is getting from those relationships at each point. And what they get from peer relationships is togetherness with individuals outside of their families and comfort in interacting with others whom they know less and have less bonds with than their families. So those are the key findings I mentioned a minute ago. The third key finding is that the profile of general peer competence in childhood and adolescence predicts relationship status in young adulthood, but not quality. However, the friendship quality profile predicts quality at ages 21 to 22, but not status. These are two separate sources of information. Both aspects of relationships, but nuanced and differentiated in what they contribute to the capacity for belonging as a person moves along through the developmental process. Now, if you have an image or a stereotype of Bowlby, what you probably have in your mind, at least in part, is the idea that you can predict from infancy and the experiences of infancy to later life experiences. And so it's a common mistake for people to think that you should be able to predict directly from infancy to all of these later adult phenomena. And we've argued that that's not necessarily the case, that there are different processes by which things move or carried forward from early life to later life, and that we need to be sensitive to a number of those different processes. So here's what we set up. We looked at early relationship quality as a predictor, yes, just like Bowlby would suggest we should. But then we looked at carrying forward cognitive representations of relationships, well-working relationships, from one age to the next up to early adulthood. Bowlby calls these representations internal working models. We say that the representations are that, but that one always has to assess them in terms of both representational and affective qualities that go along with the representation. So that's what we mean by representation. Then social experiences, relationship quality feeds into social behavior and the reactions of others to you at each different age. So that could be a pathway from early experience to later ones. So we have already a pathway through representation, a pathway through social experience to predict relationship competence in the early 20s. It turns out that all of those are significant pathways. They are fair but not strong representations of the data. So we said, what about looking at the interplay between social experiences as you move along and representations as you move along? That's really what you should be taking with you as you move to each new developmental period, and that's what we modeled here. And this is the best fitting model. When we remove that pathway, it doesn't reduce the percentage of cases accounted for by this model. There's still a relationship, but it's a weak one because you've taken out all of these things that feed into it. So should we expect developmental history to reach into adult partnerships? In what ways exactly? The first effort we made to address this question had to do with emotional experience. It's not often studied this way by people who are interested in attachment processes. But we have the idea that the experiences that were important in early caregiving relationships and in successive relationships should uniquely link to the experience and expressions of emotions in relationships. Then individuals with relatively more secure attachment histories experience and or express more positive and less negative emotions in relationships. So that's a specific prediction about emotional life that comes out of the ideas that undergird our study. So we had information from our interviews with the couples that we studied. One of the measures that they filled out for us was called an emotional tone index, created by Brashid Snyder and Omoto, our colleagues at Minnesota. And remember, they were doing this at ages 20 to 23. So they reported on the extent of positive emotions. The emotional tone index has 12 positive emotions, 15 negative emotions. They reported on the extent of positive emotions, the extent of negative emotions, and the relative balance of emotions, the mean of positive emotions minus the mean of negative emotions. We also had our observational data from watching the couples resolve conflicts together. And here, Glenn Roisman, whom I mentioned a few minutes ago when he was still a student, came up with the idea of creating a composite called the Positive Relationship Process Composite. That included our ratings of positive affect, secure base behavior, quality of conflict resolution, and quality of interaction. But he also suggested that we do a negative relationship composite made up of our ratings of negative affect, anger, and hostility, which are independent things. Does that surprise you? Anger and hostility are not the same thing, and they carry different information about how relationships proceed. The predictions we tested were that the link between regulation of emotions when distressed in the strange situation at 12 months and experiencing or expressing emotions when you're having conflict with your partner in adulthood should be related to each other. The link should be mediated through functioning in two critical areas: social competence in elementary school and security with friends in high school. Remember, we're now still looking at early attachment, social competence in grades 1 through 3, and friendship security at age 16. All measures that I've described for you already. But if you have any questions, ask them. Attachment history and emotional experience. Look that this pathway was initially fairly strong. But our hypothesis was that mediation was taking place. So infant attachment is related to peer competence. That's related in turn to friendship security, and then predicts to the adult emotional tone index balance, the balance between negative and positive emotions. And when you take this pathway out, it does not reduce what's represented by this model. Adult positive process, same story. Clear evidence of mediational pathways from early life to later life, made up of the relationship experiences that we assessed at those different points. Adult negative process, same thing. And notice that the numbers are getting a little bigger. So we are able to say a lot about the connections between infant attachment and adult negative process by looking at significant intermediate relationships in a person's experience. And then the adult composite index is, again, giving us the same picture. In each case, when we take out the direct pathway, it doesn't alter the degree to which our model accounts for the data in our study. So, self-reported emotional experience of both partners and the characteristic couple interaction patterns reflect the history of age-salient relationships from birth forward. Relationships after infancy contribute significantly over and above the direct connection from infant to adult relationships. And we think that's important to say because so often attachment formulations have been represented as saying that the important things happen in infancy. That's not entirely true. Significant things happen after infancy that make a difference in the way relationships operate and have an impact on individual functioning. In each case, we controlled for several measures of current relationship quality and functioning. So in the models I just talked about a minute ago, we controlled for partners' satisfaction with the relationship, for example. Developmental roots of conflict resolution and observational coding. Remember that I said we coded satisfaction with the resolution of a conflict. This measure assesses couples' ability to make decisions and resolve conflicts in a manner that makes them both satisfied with the outcome. The process that seems to predict best that is to discuss each side of a dispute openly, listen to each other's perspective, and accommodate both views in isolation. So that's what we call an effective resolution of a conflict. And most importantly, working cooperatively rather than having the problem-solving interaction dominated by one partner or the other. To get high scores on our coding of this, both partners need to appear satisfied with the process. And it needs to look as though working this thing out wasn't a big stress or strain for them. They can manage it within the typical patterns of their relationship. To get a low score, one partner needed to manifest dissatisfaction clearly, either actively or passively. And again, we had very good intercoder reliabilities in coding this idea. So here's what we said. Let's look at some forms or strategies of conflict resolution. Let's see how they are playing into this business of maintaining a sense of belonging vis-a-vis each other in a couple relationship. We had two that were high in symmetry, and our point there was that both partners are behaving in pretty much the same way. One is not dominating the outcome relative to the other. Doesn't necessarily mean they're behaving very well, but they were balanced in the way they were behaving. So cross-complaint means one person complains and the other person has complaints as well. Mutual avoidance means they just don't want to engage this problem. And they're both perfectly happy not to. Demand withdrawal is one of the most famous strategy patterns in the psychological literature. And that means that one partner makes a demand and the other one just withdraws and doesn't react. Really makes you mad when that happens, doesn't it? Because I know it's happened. And demand Demand comply is the parallel to that, where one partner demands and the other just simply complies. So there's low symmetry in this problem-solving strategy. So these are dyadic, holistic scales. 1 simply means the strategy was never used, and 5 means only that strategy was observed. The intercoder reliabilities, wider ranging, because it turns out cross-complaint is not as easy to judge as you would think, but 0.72 to 0.97. The most frequently used strategies were mutual avoidance and cross-complaint, the 2 balanced strategies. So satisfaction in the relationship or with the conflict resolution should depend to some degree on the degree of balance in what each person contributed. That's why we made this prediction about high symmetry being important. Now, how important is each strategy in predicting the overall conflict resolution effectiveness score? That is, the degree of satisfaction which both partners feel. Well, demand comply predicts least well of all the different strategies to satisfaction with the outcome. Demand withdraw predicts considerably better. But the 2 that predict best are these balanced strategies. So mutual avoidance, the prediction goes from 0.14. What we were doing here was taking each strategy one at a time, and then adding in the other 3 strategies as a block. So with mutual avoidance, the predictiveness of mutual avoidance climbed considerably when the other things were added, and cross-complaint did best of all, predicting to 0.43 in effect size. Now, does the combination of early relationship experiences and current resolution strategies predict the couple rating of resolution effectiveness better than either one alone? And the answer is yes. We put in the early life predictors of relationship functioning that we've used in these other studies I told you about today, plus these resolution strategies, and the effect size was 0.55. So when I said earlier that developmental history plus current circumstances makes a difference, this is a good example of the way in which both history and current experience is working together. So lessons so far. Early relationship history provides useful information about both insider perspective, that is what the people in the relationship are experiencing, because they tell us about it, and outsider experiences, or perspectives, which is what we see when we observe them resolving their conflicts, on key experiences and behaviors of established couples. The process of developmental influence is ongoing. It represents the result of both history and current circumstances, and our continuing goal is what can we learn about marital stability, satisfaction, commitment, effective functioning from attending to the interplay of history and current circumstances. We have done subsequent studies, several of them have already appeared in print, looking at recovery from conflict, which is predicted very well by early history of relationship effectiveness. Looking at commitment, which again is predicted very well by those early indicators. And that means that the whole couple interaction is being affected by one partner's early experience of relationship. These are cases of the weak link, where one partner is clearly more committed to the relationship than the other. And the weak link, having a weak link in your relationship is predicted by this early history of relationship experiences. Increasingly, we are looking at health outcomes. I mentioned that to you earlier. We have a wide variety of outcome measures that we're looking at, and we are actually bringing couples into the lab now They're doing our conflict procedures and other procedures. They're giving us blood, we hope. First time we've asked them for blood. But that's what we're going to have to do some of the biomarker work that we need to do to look at health outcomes. So the study goes on, it expands and extends the idea of the embeddedness of relationship functioning and a history of significant relationship experiences from birth forward. I'm going to stop there and see if you have any questions. Yes?
I'm sure you're only presenting a very thin slice of this.
Unfortunately, yes. Right.
Have you looked at other adult relationships beyond kind of romantic, significant other kind of relationships? And can you give us a very brief discussion?
I have not. We have not. We have not. Oh, I'm sorry. He asked if you looked at other adult relationships. And I'm going to assume you mean things like friendships, which I would love to work on. I mean, there is too little work on adult friendships in my view, and that's hard work to do, but we have a good opportunity here. And at age 32, we questioned them extensively about their friendships. We've not yet made the extra and very difficult step of actually involving friends in the procedure, but at least we have a very rich set of interview responses and test responses regarding friendship, and that's the next step. But up to now, it has just been familial relationships. Wish I could give you a different answer to that one, because that preys on my mind. Yeah, hi, Dave.
Yeah, there's sort of interesting data on transgenerational, presumably epigenetic changes, and obviously you're getting into an age group where they're going to have their own offspring, and you've seen some interesting links across generations.
Yes, we do see some very interesting links. Let me say a bit about our second generation work, because I don't think I've even mentioned that so far. We are seeing the firstborn children of our participants. Let me say first that given the risk sample we had, we expected to have a lot of babies, and we expected to have them early, and neither has happened. We have fewer babies than we would have expected overall, and they did not begin as early as we would have expected. Oh yeah, we had some that were outrageously early, but not many. And we are looking at those second generation cases to get information about our participants' skill and competence as parents. So that's been our main focus so far. We do have information, of course, about the children because we put them through most of the procedures their parents went through when they were the same age. So we will have some data to look at there, but we have not done it so far. Thanks for the question. Yeah, hi.
Hi. Have you thought about, given that it was an at-risk sample, the idea that being in the study itself provided actually some help to these people in terms of structure or resources or something else like that?
Well, yes. And of course, that's been a worry of ours from the very beginning because you worry that being in the study is itself an intervention. Because we ask them questions that are very penetrating about things that are very important in their lives. You would think that that would sort of stimulate them to think through some of them and maybe work things out. We have distressingly little evidence that that has been the effect. And which makes it all the more impressive that they're willing to continue talking to us again and again through the years. I don't know do you know the 7 Up series on British television? Well, by about 35, first we heard it, certainly at 42 and 49, they were beginning to say, I don't want to do this anymore. It's too painful to go through this again every 7 years. I'm just going to drop out. I actually don't know how many of them did, but I'm sure some of them did. So I have feared this about our participants, and yet they continue to come. They must get some benefit from talking to us, seeing us again. They love showing their children to us. So there are those little things that sort of testify to a special relationship we have with them. I wish we could say we had helped them more. Yes?
I'm actually really kind of glad that you're introducing the parents back into the study.
Yeah.
I'm interested, a lot of your models seem to be, I know they're not exactly attachment-oriented internal working models, but they seem to be insinuating that there's one working model throughout life, rather than say maybe multiple models that develop over time, maybe one with parents,
Right.
one with peers, and then one with romantic partners as you age. So can you clarify?
I appreciate the point you're making. The question was the implication of the remarks about internal working models, or representations as we call them, was that they are somewhat stable, that they persist throughout life. And many attributes of them do, but remember, we are always bringing in current circumstances. And that's why we have that back and forth model that fits the data best. It suggests that they are being modified and modulated on the basis of more recent experiences and a variety of different relationship partners. So it would be interesting to look at the stability issue, but our assumption is not that there will be great stability in those. Yes.
Have you looked at how any of these measures of relationship competencies like relate to achievements in adulthood? Because I think there's a lot to suggest that you're competent and you take those skills into other realms, but there are ways too that being less socially adept might actually work towards being more competitive.
Absolutely.
So, any ideas?
Absolutely. Well, that's exactly what you would predict for insecure relationships, a history of insecure relationships, especially avoidant ones. And we do have some information suggesting that that's the case. Right. And we have to assume that there are things in their immediate environments that are supporting the continuity of those dysfunctional behaviors, and that's poses a really interesting array of questions. But I think what we would find is that it would all be pretty lawful based on the predictions you would make about a history of security or insecurity. That's the best guess I can give you at this point. Well, thanks for coming today. Pleasure talking to you.